how can I fully determine that the Gospels were not developed to make Jesus more than he is? So there was a Jesus, and then you have Jesus written about in the Gospels. I guess you could think of it as similar to Plato and Socrates. So there was a historical Socrates. There was a man who went around annoying lots of people and was ultimately sentenced to death. But no one thinks that the Socrates we read about in, let's say, the Republic was the actual Socrates. He became a character. He became a character in Plato's writings. So I guess the idea here, Anthony, is how do we know that Jesus doesn't just become a kind of character who's embellished and who's kind of shaped by the later writers?
Yeah, well, so first of all, since you mentioned later, one thing I would observe is that the Gospels are all very early. Now, you have some people, because of theological and philosophical presuppositions, try and make them later than they actually are. And actually, they've had a pretty difficult time as the years have gone on, because more and more evidence keeps popping up that pushes the even for liberal scholars, pushes back how late they can date them. Like some scholars used to say that John's gospel was written in the 2nd century, right? But evidence kept coming to light that kept forcing them to go further and further back. And you'll notice that with liberal scholars, they're always trying to get to the very end of possibility, right? So let's say we have a bit of evidence that kind of forces us to say, well, it must have been written before AD 100. So liberal scholars will say, okay, so it was at the end of the 90s, right? But all that evidence shows is just that it couldn't have been written after that. So why do they constantly say it has to have been written at the latest possible date that the external evidence will allow? Remember, the Gospels themselves present themselves as if they were written earlier. And this is really significant, and because the Gospel writers aren't writing their books trying to counter 20th or 21st century objections, right? John's not trying to say, oh, I'm going to try and make it look like I've written this earlier so that 21st century critics who say it was written in the 2nd century will think it was written in the 1st. John's just writing a gospel, and he's publishing it in his day when people are going to be able to say, why are you writing like this? We know you didn't write this 20 years ago. You just wrote this, right? But so when you look at the Gospels, it's very evident that they're writing prior to the destruction of the temple in AD 70. This argument can be made quite easily. Think about this, for example. The book of Acts ends in AD 62 thereabouts, right? The book of Acts has Paul in prison in Rome, right? So basically, as most scholars would say, it breaks off here because Paul's in prison, and so Luke stops writing at that point, right? And we don't know what happens with Luke after that, but that's where it basically breaks off. But Acts is actually the second part of a 2-volume work. Acts is the second part of Luke's account written to Theophilus. So if Acts ends in AD 62, then the book of Luke, which was part 1, necessarily predated it. The interesting thing here is that their own theories actually end up working against them now. Because according to most scholars, Luke and Matthew were both dependent on Mark's gospel. So Mark wrote, and then Matthew and Luke come along, and they use Mark as well as this other source called Q, for which we have no documentary evidence. Nobody ever mentioned it either in the early church. But they have this postulated document called Q that Matthew and Luke are both using along with Mark to craft their gospels. But notice, if Luke is written before AD 70, because it's written before the gospel or the Acts, and if Luke is dependent on Mark, then Mark was also written before AD 70. And I could go on and on with this, but the point is, these are early books, right? And I could argue that for every book of the New Testament. Certainly the writings of Paul are all pre-AD 70, because Paul was killed by Nero, who was Roman emperor, before AD 70. So Paul and Peter were both killed under Nero. So obviously Peter's writings had to have been written before the destruction of the temple. On and on we could go. And that gives you most of the New Testament, by the way, just what I said there. You've got Mark, Luke, John, the writings of Paul, the writings of Peter. That's most of the New Testament. So in terms of embellishment, that's just really early. And most scholars think that you need more time for the kind of embellishment that would have to be true in the case of the New Testament, right, to really say that they've upgraded Jesus. The other problem is that Paul's writings actually were before the Gospels, right? Paul was writing in the 50s. And even before that, if you look at something like Thessalonians or Galatians, but Paul has the highest view of Jesus you could ask for. Paul calls Jesus our great God and Savior in Titus 1:13, or 2:13. He calls him God who is forever praised in Romans 9:5. He says that Christ in Philippians 2, he says, although existing in the very nature or form of God, did not consider the equality that he had with God something to be used to his own advantage, but humbled himself by taking the form of a servant. So if somebody wants to say that the Gospels are embellishing, goodness, I don't know how you embellish on that, right? If Jesus is God, according to the earliest writer, Paul, there really isn't anywhere to go in terms of embellishment. And you could add here a bunch of stuff, right, just historically in terms of Jesus dying for sin, all the essential claims of Christianity, that Christ died on the cross, that he was buried, that he rose again, that he appeared afterwards, that his disciples believed he was alive. All of that can be traced back to within a couple of years of the events.
And one point that I would add is we're familiar with a lot of the objections, the early objections to Christianity, right? Even if you're saying, oh, but they're included in the Gospels. Well, yeah, that's because the Gospels are responding, or sometimes responding, or drawing attention to objections in order to refute these objections. Guess what? If they're refuting objections against Jesus and against Christianity, then those objections were around there. So we have an idea of the early objections to Christianity. So just by knowing what some opponents of Christianity were saying, you get an idea of what's going on. So when the religious leaders accuse Jesus of performing miracles by the power of Satan or the power of Beelzebub or something like that, look at what they're admitting, right? If Christians were embellishing and saying, hey, we're going to make up stories about Jesus performing miracles, then the response would be like, what are you talking about? We never saw any of that. Stop lying. He's just a regular guy. What are you talking about? He's a carpenter minding his own business. Shut up. Quit making all these stories up. What are you talking about, right? Instead, it's, okay, so he's performing all kinds of miracles, but he's doing it by the power of the devil. Well, what are they admitting? They're admitting Jesus is known as a miracle worker in his own time. So you have things like that. You have things with with the empty tomb and so on. We know an early response was that the disciples stole the body. Well, what are they admitting? They're admitting that the body comes up missing and so on. So just by becoming aware of the objections to Christianity, what you don't find is, no, you guys are making all this stuff up. You find alternative explanations to account for what they all knew was true. And so even if you just go with that, you find a lot of reliable information that doesn't sound like the Gospels are just making up this stuff about miracles and so on.